All right. Hello and welcome back to the 101 Fantasy Football Show on YouTube. My name is Sawyer. I'm your host as always. And we are doing our last divisional breakdown video today. That is going to be the NFC West. If you missed out on the other divisional breakdowns, they are all up on the YouTube channel. You can see us go through all the other 7 divisions, break down each of those teams, as well as talk a little bit of Dynasty at the end of each team. But yeah, today we are going to wrap it up, talk NFC West just before the season gets started. It is Tuesday today. The season starts on Thursday. I am very, very excited. I could not be more excited about the season this year. As a hockey fan, as a basketball fan right now, hockey, my team's out of the playoffs. Basketball, the Raptors didn't look great last night. They're on the edge of being knocked out. It'll be nice to have some football coming in, some stuff to watch, some teams to cheer for, some players to cheer for in our fantasy football league. So without further ado, let's jump into the video. If you like some of this research and stuff, you can find me over on Twitter at Sawyer_FF. I post all my research there as well as some other tidbits I find. And you can also follow the show at the 101FFS. Both of those are in the description box below. So today we are talking Arizona Cardinals, Los Angeles Rams, San Francisco 49ers, and Seattle Seahawks. Right here, these are my overall projections, which we will come back to at the very end of the show. But for now, let's start with the Arizona Cardinals, the first team that we're going to talk about today. Now, the Cardinals are a very interesting team for fantasy football because, well, they brought in DeAndre Hopkins this offseason. They already had Kyler Murray. They've got Kenyon Drake, who looked awesome at the end of last year. They've got Christian Kirk, who is going into his 3rd year as a receiver, who took a massive step forward last year in terms of at least his target share. And so there's a lot to kind of digest here and try to figure out with this offense. So the first place I wanted to start is with the offense as a whole. As a whole, last season, going into the year, Cliff Kingsbury was talking about running like 85 plays per game, which is just mind-boggling numbers. No team did that last year. Newsflash, the Cardinals did not do that last year. However, what they did do is that they were 4th in pace of play on offense, according to that stat you can find on Football Outsiders. And so what does that mean? It just means that when they had the ball, they weren't taking a lot of time in between snapping the ball between plays. And so as a result, when they have the ball, they run more plays than other teams would. And so although that didn't turn into a lot of attempts here, which you can see, it does project positively for the future because, well, last year they did struggle. They had a lot of 3-and-outs where they couldn't stay on the field. However, they were running at an up-tempo pace. Now this year, you have Kyler and Cliff Kingsbury in their 2nd year together, both their 2nd year in their roles. So Kyler being an NFL quarterback and Cliff being an NFL head coach. But they go into 2nd year. They also add DeAndre Hopkins into the offense to make this offense better. The offense looked better once Kenyon Drake was in it last offseason. They keep him last season. And so I think as a result, they will be more effective keeping them on the field. And if they're going to continue to run at that pace, that means more attempts. And more attempts means they can have more rushing attempts and more passing attempts than they did last year, boosting all the fantasy assets on the team. When we look at the quarterback position, it's Kyler Murray at the helm. An exciting player for 2020 fantasy football because, I mean, from a lazy comparison perspective, last season's MVP of the year was Lamar Jackson in his 2nd year as a quarterback. 2nd year in the NFL as a quarterback. And then Patrick Mahomes, the year before that, is his 2nd year starting in the NFL as a quarterback. Not his, it was his 2nd year, but it was his 1st year starting, 2nd year in the NFL, as an NFL quarterback where he was the MVP. And so who would be the 2nd year quarterback who could be the MVP? It could be Kyler Murray. And so that's kind of the lazy comparison. People are looking to him to be the big breakout quarterback of this year. However, I think as much as he's poised for a breakout, I'm not expecting him to have anything like what Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes had of those past 2 years. When we look at Kyler Murray, what he does have, though, is that he was the quarterback 8 already last season as a rookie, and he did that playing through a bit of a hamstring injury towards the back half of the year. If you look at what he did before he took that injury, so that would have been week weeks 1 through 11, where he didn't have the hamstring injury, he was actually the quarterback 5. And by the way, all of these stats can be found on Fantasy Pros. You can go to their website and you can sort, depending on week to week, you can set the number of weeks to see who is the best within that time span. But anyway, yeah. So the quarterback 5 from weeks 1 through 11, before he started facing the hamstring injuries, and so you look at that, he already was producing. He gives you a really nice rushing floor, and you add in that it's his second year with Cliff. The overall effectiveness I've already spoken to, and he gets a new weapon in DeAndre Hopkins. That DeAndre Hopkins is a special, talented wide receiver. He might not be the number 1 wide receiver for fantasy this year, but he's a very, very talented NFL wide receiver, one of the best in the league for sure, and an asset that Kyler Murray is going to be very happy to have. And so as a result, Kyler Murray comes in at quarterback 5 for me, with all those things benefiting him. I think it's his ceiling, I would say, is a top 3 quarterback. His floor, probably top 10, just because I don't see with his rushing ability him really falling too low unless he were to get injured. But as long as he's healthy, I think quarterback 10 is his floor for the year. And right now his ADP is quarterback 6. So pretty good at the price you're getting him. Then at the running back position, we have Kenyon Drake leading this backfield, followed by Chase Edmonds and then Eno Benjamin, who we won't talk about at all. Kenyon Drake, one thing to talk about with Kenyon Drake is that last season, once he joined the team in half PPR, he was the running back 3 in fantasy football. Yeah, running back 3. So he did have one huge game where he scored 4 touchdowns, and that might inflate it a bit, but even still, running back 3 over that time span is not something we can ignore. Even if it was RB6 or RB7, you take away like 1 or 2 of those touchdowns, he still would be a very, very solid running back for fantasy purposes. And this year, what do? They went and they traded David Johnson. They gave Kenyon Drake a 1-year deal or whatever it was, some sort of extension or franchise on him. It wasn't a franchise, but it was something else that they gave him to keep him locked up for 1 more season in Arizona. Because they want to see what they got in him. He was awesome last season, and I expect them to give him a ton of run this year in this offense. And so he did have a bit of an injury, it seemed. He was in a walking boot a couple weeks ago, and so people panicked a little bit about that. There was news that Cliff Kingsbury was saying Chase Edmonds has a 3-down work skill set. However, it's going to be Kenyon Drake. He practiced on Monday in full, so he should be ready to go for this Sunday without any issues. He did say about the walking boot, it was because he had some minor nicks and bruises, so just a precautionary thing. Kenyon Drake is a guy who I'm a big fan of for this year. He showed the production. He's always been talented, but he's been stuck in Miami. Now he gets a high-powered offense who's going to run and pass just a lot. They're going to be on offense a lot. They're going to take shots a lot. He's going to get work in both the running and passing game, and so he is my RB9 for fantasy football in 2020, and his ADP right now is the running back 10. So again, a pretty fair value price for the player where he's going right now in drafts. Chase Edmonds, I do think he's a good skill set, and I think he's a good handcuff, so I did want to mention that as well. If you do have Drake, it's not a bad idea to be handcuffing him. Edmonds is one of the few handcuffs I would be targeting in fantasy football. At the receiving positions, we have the wide receivers in this offense, who are DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk, Larry Fitzgerald, and Andy Isabella, I believe, will be the 4th one this year in the pecking order. And then at tight end, they have Dan Arnold, who they brought in towards the end of last year, played a couple games, caught a couple touchdowns, but never been a big asset. And so I'm not going to talk much about Dan Arnold. I think he's a guy you could take as a dart throw in a deep league if you want to toss him on your bench, but I don't think you're going to need to. He's someone to keep your eyes out for to see if he gets more targets than people are expecting. He used to be a receiver. Now he's a tight end. He's kind of been a bit of both when he was over in New Orleans. And so an interesting piece to watch, but nothing super special there. At the receiver position, though, we do have a bit to talk about because DeAndre Hopkins comes in. How does this affect Christian Kirk? How does it affect Larry Fitzgerald? How does it affect DeAndre Hopkins? Well, let's talk about it. So first things first, DeAndre Hopkins has been averaging a massive target share in Houston, where he's getting over 30% of the targets when on the field. This year, that's just not going to happen. This year, he comes into an Arizona offense that likes to spread the ball around. They like to run 4 wide receiver sets sometimes. in a spread offense style. And what that means is just that Kyler Murray is going to have a lot of options on the field, and instead of funneling them all into Hopkins, he will throw it to Hopkins quite a bit, but he will utilize those other options more than what Deshaun Watson was doing in Houston. And so first things first is that DeAndre Hopkins will have his targets decrease this year. I'm fairly confident that his target share will come down. On top of that, something else that you can find is that something else I found is that roughly 15%, there's a 15% decrease in fantasy points for wide receivers when they switch teams. And Brandon Cooks seems to be the outlier to this. But most wide receivers, when they switch teams, they switch offenses, they switch quarterbacks, they face a 15% decrease in their fantasy points, which is something to watch for DeAndre Hopkins if you are going to be spending high draft capital on a player like him. Then I want to talk about Christian Kirk as well. Christian Kirk last year took a massive step forward. His targets jumped from the 60s up to over 100 in just 13 games, while also playing some of those games as playing through injury. He took a step ahead of Larry Fitzgerald as the number 2 in this offense. He's going to get some run on the outside as well as from the slot, and he's been getting a lot of hype, not from the fantasy community, but from his own quarterback and his coach. Both of them have been giving him rave reviews over the offseason, especially these last few weeks. They've been giving him a lot of hype. So something to watch out for is that he will be the number 2 in this offense over Larry Fitzgerald. And this comparison that I want to make is last season, people were really excited about Odell Beckham going to Cleveland, where he was going to be playing with Baker going into year 2 in this offense, and they were both going to be awesome. But instead, Odell wasn't that great, and he did have to play through injury, yes, but someone else on the team was actually very good, and that was the guy who'd been in the offense a year before, had played with Baker for a year before, knew the offense better, and was more of the slot receiver who would pick up a good chunk of targets but fly under the radar, and that was Jarvis Landry. And a lot of that, there's a lot of similarities there to Kyler Murray, getting DeAndre Hopkins new to the system. That's the hot new hotness. But Christian Kirk is the guy who's played with Kyler for a year, played in the system for a year. He's a safe, reliable target in this offense who's being undervalued in your drafts. And so as a result, that's narrative street for me. That's very much a narrative instead of actual statistics to support that. However, something to watch is that right now the ADP for these guys is DeAndre Hopkins is going off the board as the wide receiver 5. Christian Kirk is going off the board as the wide receiver 46. In my own rankings, the way I see it shaking out, I think Kirk gets more touches than people think. Hopkins' targets coming down a bit, and as a result, he's a bit less of a rock solid fantasy asset as he's been in the past. And so for me, DeAndre Hopkins is the wide receiver 7, a little bit lower than his ADP, and I have Christian Kirk at the wide receiver 37, almost 10 spots above his ADP. So I think Kirk's a value. I think Hopkins is a little bit overpriced right now. Larry is an okay pickup at the end of your draft, but he doesn't bring up a lot of upside. And so if you are drafting late and you've realized you've taken a lot of shots on players who are hit or miss, maybe you do want to get a guy like Larry who you can plug and play until one of those guys hits. However, if you have a pretty solid starting lineup in your league, I don't think he's a guy you really need to be drafting and redraft for now, because he's not going to bring you that wide receiver 1 or wide receiver even 2 upside, potentially being the 3rd target on this team. And finally, I want to touch on the dynasty aspects for the Cardinals. First things first, Kenyon Drake, he has a 1-year contract, and so it sounds like they want to sign him. If I had to make a prediction, I would think that they will re-sign him. However, keep that in mind. If you're in a dynasty league, you're going to want to own Chase Edmonds if you have Kenyon Drake. If Kenyon Drake gets hurt, you get to play Chase Edmonds. That's great. But also, if something happens in the offseason, Kenyon Drake ends up not re-signing, hits free agency, there is a chance Chase Edmonds will have an opportunity to take over the starting role. I know there's going to be a lot of new pieces in the offseason. It's likely they might sign someone, but keep that in mind. Take the chance on Edmonds if you can buy him cheap. Like I said, Cliff Kingsbury did say he has a 3-down back skill set that could be speaking to them potentially using him in that way if something were to happen to Drake. The other one I want to talk about is Andy Isabella. He's going to be the 4th receiver on this offense this year, but we don't know how long Larry Fitzgerald will be here. The team, there was some CeeDee Lamb draft hype. They chose not to draft a receiver. In fact, they didn't draft a receiver at any point in the draft this year, despite it being one of the strongest wide receiver classes in a long time. And they also cut Hakeem Butler. And so both of those things to me point that they have a lot of confidence in what they have in the room already. That would be Andy Isabella and Keyshawn Johnson. But reports to me that I've seen are that Andy Isabella is the guy that they like. He was their second-round draft pick last year, whereas Johnson was the sixth-rounder. Isabella showed some flashes towards the end of the year. He's got tons of speed, a little bit undersized, but he could end up being really good on the outside or the inside, kind of being a versatile weapon who is sheltered from top coverage. So a guy who I'm willing to take a shot on in Dynasty who costs you almost nothing right now because of his first-year production. All right, so that was the Cardinals. Let's talk the Los Angeles Rams, the team that has been featured on Hard Knocks. They've been actually kind of fun to watch over Hard Knocks. Kind of cool to see the inside of what's going on behind the scenes with Sean McVay and his team. And first thing I want to talk about again is pace of play, because just like the Cardinals, the LA Rams are a team that has a very high pace of play. Their pace of play last year was third, one spot ahead of the Cardinals. What it means, again, there are going to be a lot of attempts, which means good chunk of rushing attempts, good chunk of passing attempts. Now, towards the end of last season, they did switch things up a bit. They used to be a very, very heavy three wide receiver sets, lots of passing. And I think this season, or towards the end of last season, they switched it up, starting to go to more two tight end sets. They were able to run the ball. They started to give Todd Gurley a bit more run. And so my prediction is that it's going to be slightly more rushing than normal. They've got three guys who they can run the ball with. They've got Cam Akers, Darrell Henderson, and Malcolm Brown. And so I do have the rushing attempts going slightly up and the passing attempts going slightly down. It's not a huge thing, but it is about 30 attempts here and there. And so it does have an effect on the fantasy points for these players. So looking at the quarterback position, I don't have Jared Goff going over 600 passing attempts like he did last season. However, something to note with Jared Goff from last season that makes him a potential guy that I'm looking to target as a second quarterback on my team very late in the drafts if I felt like my first one isn't super rock solid and I want to shoot for some upside. Jared Goff, in his first 2 years with Sean McVay on the team, his touchdown percentage was 5.9% in the first year and 5.7% in the second year. Then last year, it fell off a cliff, and he only threw a touchdown percentage of 3.5%. And so I personally believe that's an outlier. 3.5 is not just low for Goff, but it's low for the average NFL quarterback. I think Goff is at least an average NFL quarterback. And so I think we're going to see some touchdown positive regression this year. That's why I do have him statted for 4 extra passing touchdowns this year on top of what he had last season. And if I'm a little bit wrong on this shift and they are still going to pass the ball over 600 times and he's going to have a better touchdown percentage, he will get yards because he has some good pieces in this offense to throw to. And so Jared Goff could be a guy that you're picking up at the end of your drafts who could end up getting back into that back-end quarterback one conversation by the end of the year. So an interesting target at least that you can be getting right at the very end of your drafts or on the waiver wire as a streamer guy. Now the running back, and side note, so his ADP is quarterback 18. My rank is quarterback 19. So pretty much I think he's decently priced where he's at, but if you want to take the chance on the upside, I think he has some. All right, the running back position. Generally speaking, this is a backfield I'm avoiding. They have Cam Akers, the guy they drafted this year in the second round, a pretty good prospect out of Florida State. Darrell Henderson, the guy they drafted last year out of Memphis, and Malcolm Brown. Those are going to be the 3 big names. John Kelly was in the mix for a little bit this offseason, but they've cut him. I think it was just a bit of coach speak that they were going to use 4 backs. I don't think they will. They're going to use 3. But these are the 3 guys, and this is what you need to know. First off, Darrell Henderson was dominating this offseason after not really having any production in his rookie season. He was picking up the offense really well. He was getting the run with the first team, and it was looking like Henderson was probably going to be the starter to start the year. And Akers being the prospect who's got a lot of athletic traits, but he's raw in terms of his vision and his patience behind the line of scrimmage. It looked like he was going to take the backseat to start the year. Then, in the middle of August, Darrell Henderson goes down with an injury, and he still has yet to practice fully with the team. I know he's been limited in his sessions in the last week or so, rejoining the team, and Sean McVay has been optimistic about his chances at being there for week 1. But as a result of him being out, Malcolm Brown, the veteran on this team, and Cam Akers, the rookie with all the upside, have been splitting those number one duties. And so coming into week one, it is a little bit of a hot mess. And on top of that, last season, um, this offensive line just was pretty putrid in terms of their run blocking ability. They should be better this year. They get their guys all healthy, and it's actually not a terrible unit when you look at the personnel, but it's still going to be a bottom half unit, in my opinion, and so not an amazing running game, especially when you have a guy like Cam Akers. He doesn't have a lot of vision. He doesn't have a lot of patience, but they're going to want to try to get him on the field, I think, because of his athletic traits, and he's going to have to create a bit, which he did at Florida State as well. He had no offensive line. He had to find ways to create himself. And so my projection shakes out that at the start of the year, it's going to be Malcolm Brown and Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson easing back in because of his injury. And then as the season goes on, Akers is going to be more of the lead dog. Henderson is going to get a good amount of usage as well. And Malcolm Brown will start to fade out as the team realizes they just have these really good athletic, talented players in Akers and Henderson who they're going to try to develop into high caliber NFL running backs, whereas Malcolm Brown is more of just a jag. However, even with that being my projection, I have Cam Akers ranked 30 and his ADP is running back 25. So a bit high, a bit rich for my blood. Darrell Henderson, I have him as the RB 49. His ADP is 46. It's a bit better, but again, a little bit rich for my blood. If you want in on this offense, I think you should be drafting Henderson. You can draft him later, and I think his chance, it's like a 60-40 between him and Akers for who's going to actually come out as the lead dog. And so if you can get the value, pick up Henderson a few rounds later, I think where Akers is going, you just draft a solid wide receiver and you can take the shot on Henderson towards the end of your draft. Now let's look at the wide receivers. First one I want to talk about is Robert Woods, because I didn't even recognize this until going through and finding his ADP as well as my ranking. I was looking at teams I have. I've drafted him in a lot of different spots, but I didn't realize how much higher I was on Robert Woods than the community is. Last season, and the year before that, actually, Robert Woods has had over 130 targets. This year, they say goodbye to Brandon Cooks, and to replace him, obviously they have Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee because they did switch to more of two tight end sets where only two receivers on the field. But on top of that, they've got Van Jefferson coming in, who has been apparently stellar in camp, a very good prospect that I'm a big fan of for Dynasty. But him and Reynolds are just not at the caliber that Brandon Cooks is as an NFL player quite yet. And so I think we're going to see Robert Woods still continue to get his large target share because no one came in really to steal those targets from him. On top of that, he has a fairly good catch percentage in this offense with Jared Goff. Last year it was almost 65%. So he's going to catch the ball. He's not going to have something in the 50s for a catch percentage. He's going to have a decent yards per reception like he has over the past few seasons. And you look at last season, the only thing that was keeping Robert Woods out of the top 12 in fantasy football for half PPR wide receiver scoring was that he only scored 2 touchdowns. 2 touchdowns is an anomaly, in my opinion, for Robert Woods. He caught 6 passing touchdowns the year before. But if you met in the middle and you gave him 4 touchdowns last year, he would have been a top 12 fantasy football wide receiver in just 15 games. If you just gave him 2 extra touchdowns, 4 total touchdowns, which is not a lot to ask. So this year, I project him to get a fairly average, I would say even below average total for a number 1 wide receiver in an offense, giving him 5 receiving touchdowns in his projection. And as a result, he finishes out as my wide receiver 9 for 2020 fantasy football. You can get him right now as the ADP wide receiver 25. I've been getting him as my 3rd receiver in multiple drafts. Some leagues he's my 2nd receiver, but either way, I think he has the ability to give you a wide receiver 1 production this season, and you're getting him at such a value. So Robert Woods, I think an absolute steal at his price right now. Even if I'm wrong on the touchdowns, he's going to give you solid floor on the targets and the yards. I mean, it's crazy to me. I don't think there's any way he doesn't at least score 4 touchdowns this season. I just don't see it happening 2 years in a row where he just doesn't get any red zone looks. And like I said, Jared Goff, I'm expecting his touchdowns to go up because he had such a low touchdown percentage last year that would also be an outlier to me. So I just think these touchdowns are going up. And as a result, Robert Woods is going to be rock solid as a wide receiver 1 back end. Then Cooper Kupp is the number 2 receiver in this offense to me. Why do I say that? Because you'll say, well, Cooper Kupp was the wide receiver 4 in fantasy football last year. Like, how can you say that? To me, when I look at Cooper Kupp, before the bye week, the first 8 weeks of the season, before they switched over to this 2 tight end look, Cooper Kupp only had less than 8 targets in one single game. And in that game, he had 6 targets. So for 7 of the 8 first games, he had more than 8 total targets, or 8 targets in each game. Then after they make the switch, Cooper Kupp only saw more than 6 targets twice the rest of the season. Only twice did he get more than 6 targets. So his target share took a huge decline. He was scoring touchdowns, and that was what was keeping his fantasy football scoring alive. However, touchdowns are somewhat hard to predict. He had 10 last year. Like I said, Robert Woods only had 2. So I think if Robert Woods is going to get a few more, Cooper Kupp might get a few less this year, despite being still a very good touchdown target. But the other thing I want to point out is that his snap percentage, he was in the 90% range, and he started to fall around to the 60 to 70% range in terms of snaps on the field. Robert Woods was the guy who was staying on the field all the time. So I think Cooper Kupp is the number 2 in this offense. He has a sore ankle or some sort of injury that's hampered him a little bit through the walkthroughs in training camp. I think his touchdown regression will be minor, but enough to make a little bit of an impact. I don't think we're going to see double-digit touchdowns again from him this year if I had to bet. And I think when we look at the targets, like, I don't think he can repeat his 134 targets because he was getting so many targets at the start of the season, and that really started to come off in the back half. And so I think if we look at the trend of the back half, I think he'll be more in the 6 to 8 range instead of the 8 to 10 range for targets per game, and that will have a negative impact on his fantasy performance. As a result, he is my wide receiver 18, despite being the wide receiver 16 at ADP. I think if he's being drafted 9 receivers ahead of Robert Woods, I think if you want a Rams receiver, wait, draft Woods a couple rounds or maybe 1 or 2 rounds later, and you'll be thanking me at the end of the season. The other 2 guys, Reynolds and Jefferson. Reynolds is nothing special, and Jefferson is something special. If you're going to buy any of them, Jefferson is an okay late round stash, potentially the very last round of your draft. You could look at him, or just look at him on the waiver wire, watch the Rams play, see how his snaps compare to Josh Reynolds. If he gets ahead of Reynolds, he might be someone you want to pick up, because if something happens to Woods or Kupp, Van Jefferson has the talent to be a very good receiver in this league. And then at the tight end position, another guy we need to talk about briefly is Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee, towards the end of last year, exploded onto the scene in the back half once they switched to a double tight end sets. However, Gerald Everett also went down. So Tyler Higbee will not be a top 3 tight end like he was in the back, 4 or 5 games it was of last season, where he was giving you like 20 fantasy points per week. However, what I do think will happen is I think Gerald Everett will still get like 60-something targets this year. I've got him projected for 68. He'll have a decent role in this offense, but Tyler Higbee will become the 3rd passing target in this offense in total. He's going to see a large amount of targets in comparison to what most tight ends see. And as a result, you can rely on him, I think, as your tight end this year. He's my tight end 6. He's the ADP tight end 7. I think he's worth his draft price. In terms of Dynasty, I do want to mention one more thing, or a couple more things. First off, this team is very cap strapped. They do not have a lot of cap room to sign players or extend players. That is tough for Cooper Kupp, because Cooper Kupp, his contract is up at the end of this year. I think there is a very, very real chance that they aren't able to re-sign him. They let him walk. And Van Jefferson, who the coaching staff has said, Aaron Donald has said he is ready to make an immediate impact. Jared Goff has said he reminds him of Cooper Kupp when he was first coming in, how ready he was, how prepared he was as a rookie. And the coaching staff has said this guy looks like a blend of all of our starters. He has traits that he's kind of like a blend of all of their traits together. And so I think there's a real world where next year it's Robert Woods and Van Jefferson as the number 1 and number 2. So one of the reasons why I'm so high on Van Jefferson in Dynasty. And the last thing is Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson are the 2 to own. Cam Akers does have a lot of long-term upside if he can figure out his vision issues, I guess, because he isn't used to reading the offensive line, because, well, when he was learning the position at Florida State, they didn't really have an offensive line that would give him holes. And so he had to just create out of nothing. So he's going to have to develop his patience. He's going to have to develop his vision, but he has all the athletic traits to be successful. So he's someone that if he gets off to a slow start, I might be looking to buy in Dynasty leagues, hoping that he can figure it out, and that athleticism paired with some patience and vision can turn him into a very, very good running back in the NFL. All right, the San Francisco 49ers, they stormed onto the scene last year. I don't think anyone expected them to be as dang good as they were. But what I do think is going to happen this year is that they did storm onto the scene. When you storm onto the scene, other teams take notice. When you go to the Super Bowl, other teams take notice. When you lose in the Super Bowl because the Chiefs make you try to pass the ball, teams will notice. And so as a result, what I think will happen this year is this team is not going to be able to run as much as it did because teams are going to stack the box and they're going to do everything they can to try to make the San Francisco 49ers beat them by using Jimmy Garoppolo. And so as a result, I think they'll have a few more attempts in games. I think their games are going to be a little bit closer. I don't think they're going to be as dominant as they were for the first stretch of last season, where they rattled off like 8 or 9 wins in a row. And Jimmy Garoppolo is going to have to try to pass the ball a bit more because teams are going to try to make him pass the ball. They want the ball in Garoppolo's hands. They don't want the ball in these running backs' hands. So Jimmy Garoppolo, we look at him this season. Attempts are up. However, I don't think he's all that much more than a game manager. So for me, I'm avoiding him as a starting quarterback for my fantasy team. I think he's a okay streaming candidate in a nice week, but a guy you can leave on the wire. At the running back position, we got a bit of a mixed backfield. We got Raheem Mostert, who, let's talk Raheem Mostert. He should start. He'll be a risky bet to rely on for the entire season. However, start of the year, he should be the guy. You look at how efficient he's been over his 4-year career. His career average yards per carry is, I think, 6 yards per carry, which is just incredible. He's been extremely efficient. He's locked in. Once he became the starter last year, he was a locked and loaded running back 1. He was the RB7 on the season. Let's not forget that when they got to the playoffs, he absolutely torched the Green Bay Packers in a game where it really mattered, right? When it came down to when it really mattered, Kyle Shanahan wanted Raheem Mostert on the field. Mostert saw 29 carries. He had 220 yards. He had 4 touchdowns. I know that didn't affect you in fantasy football, but make sure you know that that is what he performed like in the playoffs. In a fantasy week, that would single-handedly win your fantasy week. In that game, only 7 total carries to Tevin Coleman and Matt Breida combined. Now, why do I think he's maybe risky to hold the job? Because when you hear all those things, it should make sense. Raheem Mostert is the guy. I think Jerick McKinnon coming back is a very real thing that we need to take a look at because Jerick McKinnon is a guy they really loved, and he just hasn't been healthy. Now, reports out of camp have been that he has been super dynamic and really, really good in camp. He looks explosive. He looks like he's working his tail off. He looks like he's in the best shape of his life. Jerick McKinnon, they did restructure his contract to make sure they can have him. They did that with Mostert as well. And Tevin Coleman is still there. And Tevin Coleman, although I don't think he will ever be the starter on this team, will continue to take carries. And so with Kyle Shanahan, you're kind of playing roulette. You never know what he's going to do. It looked like Matt Breida was probably going to have the role last year. And by the end of the year, he was barely getting on the field. And so it's a tough bet for season-long leagues. But at his price, Raheem Mostert right now, the ADP running back 24, I think it's worth the draft selection. I have him as the running back 22. At least for the first few weeks, you're going to be able to use him, and I think he's going to give you very solid fantasy production in those first couple weeks. And if you end up trading him then for something of more value or something that might be more stable throughout the year, well done. If not, you can ride it out and hope it works out for you. Something else I wanted to note is Jerick McKinnon. I don't think you really need to draft Tevin Coleman. I don't think he really has much opportunity to be like anything special this year other than maybe a handcuff to Mostert. However, Jerick McKinnon does have a lot of upside, especially for a player who's going undrafted in most leagues or the RB 87 where his actual ADP is. He's my RB 45, so keep that in mind. They signed him to a $7.5 million per year deal worth a total of $30 million just 2 years ago. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to play because of injury for those first 2 years. But you have to remember he was a dynamic receiving weapon when they brought him in. He had 121 targets in his final 2 seasons in Minnesota. So this 48 target number might be a little bit too small. Like there's a chance he sees up more like 60 or 70 targets in the offense. Again, he's apparently looked amazing in camp. And the other thing is that his athletic comparable is LaDainian Tomlinson. He is a freak athlete, Jerick McKinnon. We forget that because we haven't seen him play football in 2 years. But this guy is extremely athletic, and if it sounds like he's in the best shape of his life, performing better than anyone's seen him perform, the team's super excited about him. He's going to be a piece that I would be very, very much targeting at the back end of my draft. Pick him up with your last pick in the draft, and you may be getting a guy who is getting multiple targets, 4 or 5 targets per week, as well as some carries, and can give you some flex start appeal. Or he could even take over the starting job if Raheem Mostert doesn't perform. But for now, you can draft him in the very end of your draft. He's got upside, and he's worth the shot. At the receiver positions, there's really not a ton to talk about. When you look at George Kittle, he just got locked up long-term. He is a beast. He is an elite weapon when he's on the field. Week 1, they play Arizona. Arizona was the worst against tight ends last year. So if you do draft him, you're going to get to have that really, really awesome Week 1 matchup, which is going to be sweet. And he's locked and loaded as a top 2 tight end option for fantasy football as long as he's healthy. He's the number 1 in this offense. Debo's not healthy yet, so it's really just the George Kittle show. So I'm a big fan of Kittle in 2020. That's pretty obvious. You look at the receiver positions, a little bit more to digest here. However, there's not much I really would want to own in fantasy football. I think there's 2 guys that you might want to own in 2020. One is Debo, one is Ayuk. Sounds like Debo might be ready for Week 1. That wasn't the initial reports, but as time has gone on, it sounds like he might be suiting up for Week 1. Yes, he might not be fully healthy, but right now he's a draft discount. I know on Yahoo I was doing a draft last night, and I was able to snag him as my 9th round pick or something like that. He was projected in he's ranked in the hundreds. That's way too low. His ADP is wide receiver 34. He's my wide receiver 27. I think he's an absolute slam value right now. If you don't have to draft him as a starter, then it's sweet because you don't have to start him for those first 2 weeks while he gets going. But what people don't remember is last season, he was the wide receiver 7 for the second half of the season, and he's only going into year 2 now as a really dynamic weapon who can run the ball, who can catch the ball, who is an absolute beast when he's on the field. When you get the ball in his hands, he's a rack monster. So I'm a big fan of Debo at his price. And the other one to note is Ayuk because, well, he is a similar skill set to Debo despite being not as big physically. He's still very athletic, lots of juice, good routes, and he should immediately be the number 2 guy replacing Emmanuel Sanders in this offense. So if you want to draft him at the very end of your draft, if Debo isn't fully healthy, and Debo does have some injury history, maybe Ayuk ends up becoming the starter at some point if Debo has to go back on the injury list or something like that. So that's how I feel about the San Fran offense for this year. Absolute value for Debo. Kittle worth his price. Jerick McKinnon and a very good sleeper. Raheem Mostert, again, worth his value. So a couple of guys that I really do like on the 49ers. In terms of Dynasty, I think you got to treat this backfield just like a 1 year at a time situation. You never know what it's going to look like even in a couple weeks. So don't buy any of them with the intention to hold them long term and rely on them long term. But I will say at the receiving positions, it's going to be Kittle, Samuel, and Ayuk for a long time. So I think you can lock those guys in and expect solid production from all of them over the course of the next few years. All right, the very last team that we will be talking about, the very last team that I have not broken down yet, is the Seattle Seahawks, a team that I love for fantasy football because I'm a fan of Russell Wilson. I'm a fan of Chris Carson. I'm a huge fan of DJ Dallas. I'm a fan of Rashad Penny. I like Tyler Lockett. Lots of guys that I think are a bit slept on in the fantasy community that have provided a lot of good fantasy production over the last 2 years, a lot of production for my own teams. And so I'm a fan of the Seattle Seahawks for fantasy football in 2020. When you look at their attempts, they consistently do have a lot of attempts. They're a good balance between rushing and passing. Generally speaking, a more heavy rush team than most in the NFL. But when they do pass the ball, Russell Wilson is very, very good at getting touchdowns. He has a high touchdown percentage. He has a pretty high yards per completion, one of the best in the league. And so he can create passing yardage without having to force super high volume to his receivers. And so the first things first, yes, with Russell Wilson, something that people I don't think know is he's been a quarterback 1 in all 8 seasons since entering the NFL. And he has, in his last 6 years, 4 of those years, he's been a top 3 fantasy quarterback. Top 3, that's a 66% or 67% chance that you're getting a quarterback 3 over the past 6 years when you drafted Russell Wilson. And so this year, again, he is my quarterback 3. He's going as the ADP quarterback 4. He's a pretty safe pick. He doesn't lose any weapons. If anything, he gains weapons, getting DJ Dallas in the pass game, adding Greg Olsen as another tight end, DK Metcalf taking a step up in his second year. They add Philip Dorsett, the guy who's got lots of speed, which can help with his deep ball, which he's very good at. And so I think you look at Russell Wilson after Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, I think he's the most locked and loaded guy who you can be confident rolling out there every single week in fantasy football. I love me some Russell Wilson in 2020. At the running back position, Chris Carson has given you back-to-back top 15 performances over the last 2 years. He has been an absolute beast in the running game over the last 2 years, and no one ever gives this man enough love. It seems like, yes, he gets hurt, but like people think of him as just an injury-prone guy. Last year, he played 15 games. He only missed 1 game at the end of the year when he had the hip injury. Like, he was an absolute beast for fantasy last year. He had 1,230 rushing yards. I think you can lock him in again as long as he's healthy, which it sounds like he's healthy. The only reason he was missing some of camp was because he was having a family loss. He had to go back to his hometown for a funeral. That's why he was missing camp. He comes back. Carlos Hyde has said it from his own mouth. He knows he's the backup to Chris Carson. Chris Carson is the man. This team loves Chris Carson. Despite his fumbling issues, they love him. They start him. They play him. Last year, he had tons of fumbles through the start of the year, and they still played him. He's going to see volume this year. I think as long as he's on the field, this guy sometimes he's getting you 20 carries a game. Not a lot of guys get 20 carries a game. Chris Carson can get 20 carries most games. I would say 18 is probably where he averages out per game, but like he can have those big 20 carry games with a couple targets sprinkled in. Love Chris Carson at his price right now. He's the RB16. I think he's well worth that price. When you look at those top 14 backs, like I've talked about before, the next two out of there are Todd Gurley and Chris Carson, and I think they are a tier above the rest. James Conner would probably come in at 17 after that, but if you don't get 2 of the top 14, try to get Chris Carson or Todd Gurley as your RB2. I'm fine with them as a rock-solid RB2. Carlos Hyde is a handcuff for Chris Carson this year. Just wanted to toss that out there. If you have Carson, it would be a good idea to handcuff him because of his injury history. Then at the wide receiver position, we have Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett, a guy that I'm a pretty big fan of this year. He's definitely worthy of a wide receiver 2 slot in your lineup. The big question mark going into last year was he never had more than 75 targets in a season, and he did have that big jump once Doug Baldwin retired. He went up to a 110 target season, even with DK Metcalf on the team. The best part about Tyler Lockett is he doesn't need to have 150 targets to be successful because his catch percentage is absolutely incredible. 2 seasons ago, so not last year, but the year before, he had a perfect passer rating when targeted. You look at the target increase from last year, it was 71 to 110, so he did see a target increase. He still was able to maintain a 74.5% catch percentage. His career catch percentage is 71.5%, but over the last 2 years, it's been 77.2%. Russell Wilson loves throwing to Tyler Lockett because he says he thinks like a quarterback and he knows how to get open, and because he's thinking about the routes in a way that a quarterback would think about the routes. So they have this trust thing where I think a lot of his routes, especially his deep routes, are Tyler Lockett has the option. And so Russell Wilson just buys time. He's able to move around in the pocket. Tyler Lockett makes the best decision to complete the pass, and then he's wide open. Russell Wilson hits him. Deep touchdowns. Here we come. I love Tyler Lockett for that. And I think you can rely on him as your wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. He is the wide receiver 20 this year. I'm drafting him as the wide receiver 19. So pretty much right on his value. I think he's worth that price. DK Metcalf. Now he's a bit of the other option in this offense that people are interested in right now. His ADP is wide receiver 21. So just behind Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf is going. And the differences with DK Metcalf are this. I don't think DK Metcalf will separate himself from Tyler Lockett. I think it's fair to say they will have similar target numbers. However, Tyler Lockett is much more efficient with his catch percentage. DK Metcalf is not a good catch percentage guy. Last year he had 58%. I don't see him taking a huge step forward. So I do have him catching 59% of his passes this year. That does mean some more receiving yards, and some more touchdowns. But when you don't see, when you're not uber efficient with your catch percentage, and you don't see at least 120 to 125 targets in a season, I don't think you can be locked in as a wide receiver two unless you have ridiculous touchdown numbers. And so if you're drafting DK Metcalf at his price, which is wide receiver 21, I think you're relying too much on touchdowns. As a result, I have him as the wide receiver 28. So I'm off of him. Some guys you can get after him in drafts. Robert Woods, who we've talked about already, I think is an absolute steal. Also DJ Chark and Terry McLaurin, two guys who are locked and loaded as the number ones in their offense. Both of those guys are going to see more like 130 targets. DK Metcalf just won't see that. They both have potential to blow up. They're both young guys. If you want to draft a young guy with upside who you know is going to be the one in their offense, I would go with Chark or McLaurin, and I would pass on DK Metcalf. At the tight end position, I just wanted to throw some love out there to Will Dissly. I mean, the guy, when he's on the field, is a beast. Problem is he just hasn't been able to stay on the field. And so this year, I have him only projected for 10 games because he's never played more than 6. But you got to think, when he's on the field, yes, they bring in Greg Olsen. The guy is dynamic. And so you want to, like, a big shout out to him. I'm probably not drafting him at all because they have Greg Olsen. Watch him. That's all I want to say. Watch him. Keep an eye on him on your waiver wire. If something's to happen to Greg Olsen, or if Will Dissly just simply is better than Greg Olsen, George Kittle already has talked about this. He said Will Dissly is one of the best tight ends in the NFL in George Kittle's eyes. Dissly's a talented player. There's a chance he just ends up taking this job. Russell Wilson has supported many a tight end. I mean, you look at Jacob Hollister last year, even had value in this offense. So keep an eye on him. He'll be on your waiver wire. And he's a guy who, when he's healthy, he's provided tight end 1 numbers always because he gets targets and he gets touchdowns. So big fan of the man, Will Dissly. If there's anything to talk about in Dynasty for the Seahawks, it is that DJ Dallas is a very good running back prospect, especially in the pass game. More of a receiving threat than necessarily a pure runner because he switched from quarterback to receiver and then from receiver to running back in college. But it shows up on his tape because he can really catch the ball well. I know they're using him as a CJ Procise replacement for this year, probably. A lot of receiving work, but I think something we might see is you saw towards the end of last year when Rashad Penny started to get some run, he was getting the receiving work and he was actually getting some carries, some receiving work, and he was becoming a very solid fantasy asset because of how explosive he was. I think DJ Dallas can do the same thing, and he's gotten rave reviews at camp. Chris Carson, it is his last year on his contract, so there's a world where this offseason they don't re-sign him, and it's Rashad Penny and DJ Dallas is the backfield here. Seattle always produces good running backs. They have it's a pretty vanilla scheme, but they still run the ball effectively. So I think both those guys could be assets to own in Dynasty for pretty cheap right now. And then the offense, I think moving forward is going to be Russ, obviously locked in, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf as the 1 and 2 options. But remember, Will Dissly, keep him on your mind because if you can get him super cheap, I think he's worth the hold in Dynasty. So with that said, that is the final division, the NFC West. Football is almost here. I could not be more excited. I'm pumped to have this out there. Now you guys have heard me talk about all of these players, how they fare for the year, how I see it happening for the season. We're going to scroll through my projections one more time. And this is what I'm going to lock in. I'm going to lock these projections in. Season starts in just a couple days, so I can't really change it once week 1 has happened. But this is what I think is going to happen this year. And I mean, we'll see how I do. Enjoy your drafts. If you have any questions for me before the season starts or any time throughout the season, you can always interact with me on YouTube, but you can also tweet me at Sawyer_FF. That is in the description box below. Take care and good luck with your fantasy football this season.